Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and we're back with Naoki Urasawa's Monster. This is one of my favorite comics in any style of all time. It's a great suspense story, and we're looking at chapter 5. This chapter is pretty much the end of the prologue. A 5-chapter prologue is a bit of an investment, but I think it's worth it in the overall quality of the story we get based on this prologue. The prologue itself, it's not the greatest. It introduces a lot of interesting questions. It tells us some important things about the character of our protagonist, but it's not the most gripping reading in and of itself. We'll get back to that at the end of the chapter, though. I do want to present some final thoughts on this prologue and what I think it really does for us in terms of the overall story. But let's look at what actually happens in it real quick. And not a whole lot does really happen here. We open on a couple pages of Kenzo being notified that all his rivals at this hospital have now been murdered. The hospital director, the head of surgery, and one of his rival doctors, all dead of poisoning. And we have this really great shot here of Kenzo just being shocked at this news. And one of the interesting things here that Urosawa manages to convey sheerly through his artistic talent is Kenzo's innocence. And that's important because we don't actually see when these people are murdered. We only see their bodies. We don't see what Kenzo is doing at the time that they are murdered, although it is strongly implied that he's passed out drunk after having his life ruined in the previous chapter, a couple of chapters really. And but we don't know for sure until this point. Urasawa managed to give us such an honest reaction purely through his artistic ability that from this page forward, I as a reader was convinced that Kenzo was not guilty. And I think that's really amazing, a really great application of what you can do in comics as a visual medium. A lot of Western comics will kind of try and reason through this either in dialogue or narrative captions and convince the audience of this, but Urosawa manages it just through art, and I think that's really great. It's one of those things that made him my favorite artist. Again, in narrative comics, my favorite comic artist of all time is still Bill Watterson, because Calvin Hobbes is great. But when you're telling a story, you could do worse than Naoki Urasawa. And his mastery of expression, and in particular, he's very good at shock. He's very good at sort of a calm contentedness, and he's really good at showing annoyed expressions. Not annoyance with circumstances, but annoyance with people you really kind of like, but they get under your skin sometimes. He conveys a lot of expressions very well. This is one of them. So anyways, enough fanboying about that. So from this point, the story moves forward pretty much as you might expect. So there's some talk of the murders. We learned that the victims were poisoned, and that they, of course, are investigating the murders. We also learned that the twins that were in surgery disappeared about at the same time. And we learn all of this as Dr. Tenma is on his way to the hospital, and he hustles into surgery to make sure everything's okay, because they just lost a lot of their leadership. And he has a lot of experience in this area. He was being groomed to take over as head of surgery. So he shows up to do his job there because, of course, Kenzo is someone who cares a lot about his job. While he's there, the police try and interrogate him, but he puts them off until they eventually catch up to him at the funeral for the hospital director. And there we're introduced to one of my favorite characters in all of Urasawa's writing, and that is Inspector Lunge. And there may be a correct German way to say that. I apologize to all the native German speakers out there who will probably never see this video and tell me I'm wrong. But if you want me to pronounce it correctly, all you have to do is subscribe and leave a comment, and then I'll know. I appreciate it. Anyways, here we have Inspector Lunge, and so the BKA, which is I believe the German equivalent to the FBI, at least at the time. And this guy is fascinating. He's a bit of a Sherlock Holmes. He's an excellent investigator. He has this mnemonic device he does with his hands, and he acts as if all the information he's getting about a case is being typed into his brain. Like he envisions a keyboard and he types it all out, and then he files it in a disk on his brain. He has this great sequence where he explains it. I think it's on the next page. Yeah, right here, he says, I'm inputting everything into the floppy disk in my head. And this is how he remembers things, and it helps him recall details of the case and analyze them more dispassionately, more clinically, and more effectively without having to reference notes all the time. It's really cool, and you always see his fingers twitching as he's putting this information in. It makes him a really fun character to see on the page. It makes him a fascinating character to in his dialogue as he is just pulling these facts out and analyzing them. And it also makes him a little bit creepy. He's not exactly the Javert of this story. He's not a relentless pursuer for Dr. Tenma in particular, but he is quite relentless in pursuing criminals, and he can never quite make up his mind whether Tenma is one or not. Because, of course, in this situation, Dr. Tenma is a prime suspect. All three of these guys were jerks to him. They undermined his career. They took him off the path to the success he was already in. Now, of course, Tenma has decided that rather than research, his purpose as a doctor should be to save lives. And he's actually kind of grateful to the hospital director for making that so clear to him. But of course, the police aren't going to buy that as an excuse, and they have really a job to be suspicious of him. And yeah, that can kind of make them jerks, but it's their job. And Inspector Lunge is a fascinating and really fun to watch example of an investigator. This kind of investigators who spend all the time looking into innocent people can be really easy to play them as jerks or as pig-headed or as prejudiced in some way. And Lunge is none of those things. Lunge is a consummate professional who nevertheless finds all the details that point to Tenma, and he follows them even though he doesn't necessarily always buy that Tenma is the guilty party. Anyway, from Lunge we learned that the cause of death was poison candy. If you remember in Chapter 4, the director and his two cronies ate some candy from one of the offerings at the bedside of Johann, which is one of the twins from East Germany, which have now disappeared. And that is important because it explains why Tenma gets off the hook. The most likely cause of this is some kind of murder/abduction, right? The doctors are murdered and their patients are abducted because the East Germans are upset that the Liebeners escaped to the West. So, very clear-cut explanation. Yes, Tenma is suspicious. However, he had nothing against the twins. In fact, he saved Johann's life at great personal cost. So, the authorities just kind of have to give him a pass. And it does kind of look like it would make more sense to look into the East Germans as opposed to this Japanese doctor who's not really interested in the internal politics of East-West Germany, who's only been in Dusseldorf for a few years, and who admittedly did suffer some career damage, but could always go home to Japan. So, ultimately, Tenma gets a pass, and he rededicates himself to working in the hospital and saving lives. Now that her father's dead, his ex-fiancée Ava does come back to him. She's lost a lot, but he turns her down because he doesn't want to be tied back to that old life anymore. and he moves on. And that's pretty much where this chapter ends. Um, we actually, at the end, see about 10 years later, Tenma is still working here at the Eisler Memorial, and he's going back into surgery. So, this is the end of the prologue. What do we see here? Well, we see a character, Dr. Tenma, who undergoes a life-altering traumatic period of really just about a week. It was only a few days that's covered in these first 5 chapters. And in this time, he goes from a kind of self-important research doctor who is focused entirely on the contributions he is going to make to the field of medicine, who is, willing to kiss butt and curry favor with the authorities in the hospital and pursues relationships because they give him advantages and they make him feel good, to a person who is a bit older and a bit wiser and who is focused more on how what he does benefits others. And he has been, to a certain extent, rewarded to this. Now he's the head of surgery in Eisler Memorial. He's on his way up again. He's just had this little bump on the road to success, or so it would seem. And if that's all the story was, this would be pretty lackluster. But as a prologue and a foundation for the rest of this story, it is very solid because it shows us how Tenma became the moral man that we're going to follow through the rest of this story. It shows us the core of his self-identity as a man who saves lives. And it shows us what the price to arrive at that moral core was. And those things are going to deeply inform all of the decisions that Tenma makes from this point forward. So it's very necessary for us to see this, even though it is a bit long and sometimes it's kind of overdramatic in the extent of the rejection that Tenma suffers. It is an important part of understanding his character. And I mean, it's what is this? I think it's it's 120 pages, 130 pages, 135 pages of prologue essentially to the rest of the story. That is a lot. And I believe this was a monthly, so this is almost half a year of story right here. That's a lot to really wait to get to the meat, the heart of your story. But by this point, Urosawa had a pretty good reputation in the manga publishing scene, and people were willing to give him time to really set up and investigate these characters. And that's good, because Monster benefits a lot from having this kind of a setup. At the same time, we have a lot of threads that are still loose, that we don't really understand what happened. And the biggest one of those, of course, is the twins. What happened to Anna and Johann Liebner? Where did they go? Who really killed the director? Was it Dr. Tenma? I don't believe it was, and I haven't believed it was since the first page of this chapter. But it still could be. Tenma could be a better actor than we really give him credit for. And all of these questions now are going to be answered in just a little bit. But they are, in the meantime, building suspense, because again, Urosawa is a master of suspense. And they are also, once we have the answers, going to totally shift our understanding of what Dr. Tenma's life is really about. Because there is a purpose to his life, and it does have a specific role to fulfill. And whether he realizes it or not, he's been shaped by the events of this week of his life for the time to come. And, it's interesting because there's no talk of destiny or purpose beyond, of course, the purpose of Tenma's profession in these early chapters. But there is a sort of a destiny, a sort of kismet, if you will, a karma to Dr. Tenma's actions that he will have to struggle with going forward. Because ultimately, while we have the core of a man's character here, this is not a story about morals or character. It's the story of a monster. I'll see you in chapter 6.